On the night of January 6, 1982, two young women disappeared near Breckenridge, Colorado. One was named Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer. She was 29 years old. The other was named Annette Schnee. She was 21. And here is the first strange, sad fact of this case. These two women did not know each other. They had never met. Their lives had no connection, no overlap, nothing in common at all, except that on that one winter night, in the mountains of Colorado, both of them were simply trying to get home. In 1982, in those mountain towns, the way you got home was often by hitchhiking. Both of them stuck out a thumb on a cold January night. And neither one of them ever made it home. Bobbie Jo's body was found the very next day, in a snowdrift near the summit of Hoosier Pass, more than 11,000 feet up. Annette's body would not be found for 6 more months, when a boy fishing in a creek came upon her. Both women had been shot. And what told investigators that these two strangers had been killed by the same person was almost unbelievably small. It was a sock, a single orange sock, one found among Bobbie Jo's scattered belongings, and its match found with Annette. That one orange thread tied the two murders together and said, unmistakably, the same man did both. But who he was, that would take 40 years to answer. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where a tiny, overlooked detail turns out to hold two murders together, subscribe to Decades Cold and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. The answer, when it finally came, was written in blood, the killer's own blood, left behind on Bobbie Jo's glove during the struggle for her life, and preserved for 4 decades. In 2020, genetic genealogy read that blood, and it produced a name, Alan Lee Phillips. A local miner and mechanic, a man who had lived quietly in those very same mountains the entire time. And when investigators pulled the old files, they found something waiting there that made the hair stand up on the back of the neck. Because on the very night the two women vanished, Alan Phillips's truck had gotten stuck in the snowstorm on a nearby pass, the exact area where Bobbie Jo's belongings were found, and he had been rescued off that mountain. He'd been right there that night. And unlike so many of the cases we tell on this channel, this one does not end with a killer who escaped. It ends in a courtroom, with a jury. This is the story of Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee, two strangers bound together forever by the worst night of their lives, and the orange sock and the bloody glove that would not let their killer disappear. Before we go any further into how they died, I want to give real space to who these two women were, because this case has a particular cruelty in it, the way it fused together two people who never chose each other, two separate lives and two separate families, into a single tragedy. Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer was 29. She was a married woman, she had a husband, and she had a daughter, a little girl who was very young when her mother was taken. Think about that child, growing up in the shadow of an unsolved murder, knowing only that her mother went out one winter night and never came home, and that no one knew who did it or why. Bobbie Jo had a whole life in Summit County, a family, a place in her community. On the evening of January 6th, she'd been out with friends. She was, by every measure, a grown woman with roots and people and a future, and all of it was severed on a mountain road. Annette Schnee was even younger, just 21. And the detail that always stays with me about Annette is her dream. She wanted to be a flight attendant. She wanted to fly, to see places, to have the kind of life a 21-year-old imagines when the whole world is still ahead of her. She had a family too, including a little sister named Cindy, who was only 11 years old when Annette disappeared. Cindy would later describe watching their mother break down and cry over the 6 months that Annette was missing. 6 months of a family not even knowing whether their girl was alive or dead. And years later, when Cindy had a daughter of her own, she named that daughter after her lost sister. Annette never got to become a flight attendant. She never got to have the family, the travels, the long life she was reaching for. Her killer took all of it. And as one of Annette's family members would point out, with a grief so sharp it's hard to even repeat, while Annette never got to build a family, her killer went on to remain free for decades, and to have wives and children of his own. 2 women, 2 families, strangers to each other in life, bound together forever by the man who murdered them both. Let's establish what happened on January 6, 1982, because the simultaneity of it is central to everything. In the mountain towns around Breckenridge in the early 1980s, hitchhiking was simply a normal way to get around. The towns were small, the distances between them were long, public transit was thin, and thumbing a ride, especially for locals heading home after work or a night out, was ordinary and unremarkable. Both Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee were, by the accounts of the investigation, hitchhiking home that night. Annette had been working. She was last seen leaving a pharmacy in Breckenridge. Bobbie Jo had been out with friends at an establishment in town and was last seen heading toward the spot where people caught rides home. 2 women in the same town on the same night, both looking for a ride home in the cold. And both of them vanished. Not a week apart, not in different towns. The same night, the same small mountain area. At the time, of course, no one immediately understood they were connected. They were 2 separate missing persons situations, 2 separate sets of worried people. But the timing, in retrospect, is the whole horror of it. Somewhere on those dark, snowy mountain roads on the night of January 6, 1982, a predator was hunting, and in the space of that single night, he encountered not 1, but 2 women who needed a ride, and he killed them both. The odds of that? 2 separate stranger abductions and murders, in one night, in one small area, are staggering, and they tell you something about how active, how bold, and how dangerous the man on those roads was that night. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on January 7th, the day after. Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer had not come home, and her family and friends went looking for her. And as they searched the mountain roads, they began finding things, her things, scattered near Hoosier Pass, which lies along the route toward Denver. They found her backpack. They found her identification cards. They found a single wool glove. They found a bloody tissue, and they found a single orange booty sock. These items, strewn near the pass, marked the place where something violent had happened to Bobbie Jo. And then, following the terrible trail, searchers found her body down a snowy embankment off the side of the road, near the summit of Hoosier Pass, roughly 10 miles south of Breckenridge, at over 11,000 feet of elevation. She had been shot twice in the chest, and she had bled to death in the snow. And there was one more detail that spoke to the cruelty and control of her killer. On her wrist was a zip tie. She had been restrained. I'll state those facts once, plainly, and move on, because Bobbie Jo deserves to be more than the manner of her death. So within a day there was already a murder scene. A woman abducted, restrained, shot, and left on a frozen mountain pass. But Annette Schnee was still missing, and no one yet knew that her fate was tied to Bobbie Jo's. For all anyone understood in that first week, Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer was a single, horrifying, isolated crime. The connection, the thing that would reveal a predator who'd killed twice in one night, was still buried in the snow, waiting for spring, and waiting in a small pile of belongings near Hoosier Pass that included 1 orange sock too many. Annette Schnee stayed missing through the rest of that winter, and into the spring, and towards summer. 6 agonizing months during which her family did not know whether she was alive or dead. And then, in July of 1982, the mountains gave her back. A young boy, fishing in Sacramento Creek, in a rural part of Park County south of Breckenridge, discovered her body. Annette had been shot, a gunshot wound to the back, and there were signs that she had been sexually assaulted. I'm going to leave the details there, out of respect for her. What matters is that Annette, like Bobbie Jo, had been the victim of a brutal, violent attack by a predator, and that her body had lain undiscovered in that creek since the night she disappeared. She had been found, at last, fully clothed in the rural high country, far from where Bobbie Jo had been left. And now investigators had a genuinely chilling situation on their hands. 2 women, both vanished the same night, January 6, 1982. Both from the same small mountain community. Both shot to death. One left on Hoosier Pass, one left in a creek in Park County, in different locations that, on the surface, didn't obviously link. Were these two separate killers, operating by grim coincidence on the same night? Or was this one man, one predator, who had taken two women in a single night of violence across those mountain roads? The answer to that question, the thing that would prove these were not two crimes but one connected spree, was hiding in the physical evidence, and it came down to the color orange. Here is the detail that gives this case its name in the annals of Colorado crime, and it's the kind of small, strange, physical clue that this channel exists to celebrate. Remember the belongings of Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, scattered near Guanella Pass: the backpack, the glove, the bloody tissue, and a single orange booty sock. That orange sock was a problem because it raised a question: whose was it? And when investigators looked closely, they realized something significant. That orange sock, found at the scene of Bobbie Jo's abduction, was connected to Annette Schnee. The orange socks tied the two women together, one at the site where Bobbie Jo was taken, its counterpart with Annette. It was physical evidence that the same person had been in contact with both women, that whoever handled Annette Schnee had also been at the spot where Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer was attacked. In one small, brightly colored detail, the two cases fused into one. This was no longer two separate mysteries. This was a single killer, who in the span of one January night had abducted and murdered two women who had never met, and who had left, without realizing it, a thread of orange connecting his crimes. That was a crucial investigative insight. It told police what kind of monster they were looking for. Not a domestic dispute, not two unrelated crimes, but a stranger predator hunting the mountain roads. But knowing there was one killer, and knowing who that killer was, are two very different things. The orange sock proved the crimes were linked. It could not, on its own, produce a name. For that, investigators had the one other thing the killer had left behind near Guanella Pass. Something on that wool glove that, in 1982, they could not yet fully use. And so, with a linked double murder and no suspect they could prove, the case of Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee went cold. And it stayed cold for a very, very long time. For 4 decades, this case sat open in the Colorado high country, one of those defining local tragedies that a community never quite lets go of and never quite recovers from. 2 young women murdered in one night, their killer somewhere out there, possibly still among them. And the investigators never entirely gave up. In January of 2015, 33 years after the murders, officials in Summit County launched a renewed effort to find the killer. They held a public meeting. They launched a website. They put out a flyer with a stark, aching heading: "Who murdered these girls?" A phrase from another era, but one that captured the open wound the case still was. They were asking a community that had aged, that had turned over, that had in many ways moved on, to reach back 33 years and help them find an answer. It generated attention, but it did not, on its own, break the case. And through all of it, the families lived with the not knowing. Annette's little sister Cindy, who'd been 11 when Annette vanished, grew up and had a daughter, and named that daughter for the sister she'd lost. A way of carrying Annette forward, of refusing to let her simply be erased. Bobbie Jo's daughter, who'd been a small child, grew into adulthood without her mother, under the same shadow. For these families, the passage of 40 years did not soften the central fact. Someone had murdered the women they loved, and that someone had a name and a face and a life, and was, as far as anyone knew, walking around free, having gotten away with it. 40 years is a long time to carry that. But the evidence the killer left near Guanella Pass had been carefully preserved, and the science was about to catch up with him. Let's return to that wool glove, the one belonging to Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, found among her scattered belongings near Guanella Pass, because that glove held the answer to the entire case. On it was blood, and critically, some of that blood did not belong to Bobbie Jo. In the struggle for her life, a struggle fierce enough to leave a bloody tissue and scattered belongings across the snow, Bobbie Jo's killer had bled. He had left his own blood on her glove, and investigators, doing their jobs in 1982, preserved it. For decades, that blood was a locked door. They had the killer's DNA, his literal biological signature, and no way to attach it to a human being. But in 2020, the case got its long-awaited break through the technology this channel has documented again and again: forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators took the DNA from the blood on Bobbie Jo's glove, and instead of searching a criminal database, they searched the public genealogy databases, the ones where ordinary people upload their DNA to explore their ancestry. They looked not for the killer himself, but for his relatives. And from those relatives, genealogists began building the family trees, narrowing and narrowing, working through the branches toward the one man whose DNA matched the blood on that glove. And in 2020, the family tree delivered a name: Alan Lee Phillips, a name that had been out there in the Colorado mountains the entire time. The blood Bobbie Jo's killer had shed during her murder, the blood he never knew he'd left on a glove in the snow near Hoosier Pass, had, after 38 years, finally spoken his name out loud. So who was Alan Lee Phillips? He was, in 1982, a 31-year-old man. He worked as a miner and as an automobile mechanic. And the most unsettling thing about him is the most ordinary. He was a local. He lived in those same Colorado mountains, and he would continue to live there, quietly, for the next 4 decades. While the families of his victims grieved, while investigators launched their Who Murdered These Girls campaign, while the community wondered whether the killer was still among them, Alan Phillips was right there the whole time, an unremarkable mountain man, going about an unremarkable life, having gotten married, having children, hiding in the most effective way there is, in plain sight, as a neighbor. But when investigators pulled the old case files after the genealogy pointed to Phillips, they found a detail that connected him to that night with genuinely chilling force, because there was, already, a record of Alan Phillips being on those exact mountain roads on the exact night the women vanished. On the night of January 6, 1982, Phillips's truck had gotten stuck in the snowstorm on Hoosier Pass, the very pass near where Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's belongings and that orange sock and that bloody glove were found. And he had been rescued off the mountain that night. Sit with that. The night 2 women were abducted and murdered on those roads, Alan Phillips was documented as being stranded, in his truck, in the snow, in precisely the area where the evidence of one of those murders was found. In 1982, that was just a man whose truck got stuck. In 2020, with his DNA on the glove, it became a placement of the killer at the scene, on the night, in the snow. Alan Lee Phillips was arrested in February of 2021 in Dumont, Colorado, a small mountain town about an hour's drive from Breckenridge, where he had gone on living all those years, roughly an hour from where he'd killed 2 women. He was, by then, an old man, around 70, and the case that had been cold for 39 years was, at last, headed for a courtroom. And this, I want to emphasize, is where the case of Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee separates itself from so many of the stories we tell on this channel. Because so often, the genetic genealogy breakthrough comes too late. The killer is already dead, and all the science can deliver is an answer, a name, a closure without a courtroom. That is not what happened here. Alan Phillips was alive. He was arrested, and he was put on trial for 2 murders committed nearly 4 decades earlier. At trial, the evidence centered on that DNA, the blood on Bobbie Jo's glove, matched to Phillips. His defense argued that the DNA evidence had been contaminated and mishandled over its long life in storage, the kind of challenge that decades-old evidence naturally invites. But the jury did not agree. In September of 2022, a jury in Park County, Colorado, convicted Alan Lee Phillips of 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping and other charges, for the killings of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer. 40 years after 2 women vanished on a snowy night, 12 people looked at the evidence and said, with the full authority of the law, this is the man who did it. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Bobbie Jo's husband, in a statement to the court, called Phillips a despicable and evil being. The families, who had waited 4 decades, finally had their verdict. I'll add one honest, final note about Alan Phillips himself, and then I want to leave him behind, because this story does not belong to him. About 6 months after his conviction, in February of 2023, Alan Phillips died by suicide in prison. I state that simply and without detail. What matters is this: he did not escape his reckoning. Unlike the men in so many of our cases, Phillips was caught, he was tried, he was convicted by a jury of his peers, and he was sentenced to die behind bars. He faced justice. The verdict stands, and the names that matter in this story are not his. The case of Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee earns its place on this channel for 3 reasons, and I want to draw each one out. The first is the sheer, rare horror of what it reveals: a single predator who murdered 2 complete strangers in one night. Most of the cases we cover involve one victim, or a killer who struck repeatedly over years. Here, in the space of a single January night, on the roads around one small mountain town, a man abducted and killed 2 women who had no connection to each other whatsoever, linked only by the terrible accident of both needing a ride home at the wrong moment. It's a reminder of how much damage one dangerous person, on one night, moving through a place where hitchhiking was normal and trust was ordinary, can do. The second is the power of the small detail. This entire case, the recognition that these were not 2 separate crimes but one linked double murder, turned on a single orange sock. Not a witness, not a confession, not high technology. A sock, the wrong color to belong to the woman it was found near, whose match lay with another victim miles away. It's a perfect illustration of something we say often here: that the truth is frequently hiding in the tiniest, most overlooked physical detail, waiting for someone to notice what it's quietly saying. And the third is the completeness of the justice, which I don't want to undersell, because it's genuinely rare in these cold cases. The killer left his blood on a glove. The evidence was preserved. Genetic genealogy named him. The old files placed him on that mountain, that night. And crucially, he was still alive to be arrested, tried, and convicted by a jury. This is the full arc that so many cold case families never get. Not just an answer, but a verdict. Not just a name, but a courtroom, a jury, and a life sentence. After 40 years, the system delivered, completely. Let me bring this back, at the end, to the 2 women, because they are the reason any of this matters, and because the machinery of a 40-year investigation can bury them. Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer was 29. She had a husband and a young daughter and a life in the Colorado mountains, and she was heading home from an evening with friends. Annette Schnee was 21, and she wanted to be a flight attendant, and she had a little sister who loved her so much she'd one day name her own daughter for her. 2 women, on the 6th of January 1982, doing the most ordinary thing imaginable, trying to catch a ride home on a cold night, who crossed paths without ever meeting with the same dangerous man. Neither of them made it home, and their families spent the next 40 years living with that absence and that unanswered question. What I keep coming back to is how nearly this killer got away with it. He lived, for 4 decades, an hour up the road from where he'd left his victims. He married, he raised children, he grew old in those same mountains, apparently confident that a January night in 1982 had vanished into history. And he was very nearly right. If Bobbie Jo hadn't fought, if she hadn't made her killer bleed onto her own glove, if that glove hadn't been preserved, if genetic genealogy had never been invented, Alan Phillips would have died a free old man, and Bobbie Jo and Annette would have remained an eternal question. Instead, a woman's courage in her final moments, a carefully saved piece of evidence, and a technology from a future she never saw, reached across 40 years and dragged the truth into a courtroom. 2 strangers, bound by the worst night of their lives, and by a single orange sock. Say their names: Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, Annette Schnee. Their families waited 40 years, and, at last, a jury gave them the answer. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.